I'm going to talk a little bit about a piece of work in collaboration with John and Andrea Taus, and basically you can read about a lot of this on the preprint that's in the bottom part of the screen. It's probably changed a little bit as the paper's gone through peer review at the moment, but by and large, the things that I'm talking about are all there as well. So I probably don't need to convince people on this call about the benefits of data sharing. And I'm sure quite a few people are familiar with FAIR principles, so data needs to be findable, accessible, interpretable, and reusable. And I mean, I think to echo some of the earlier talks, the data that underpins our research is arguably probably almost more important in some ways than the end paper, because that's what underpins the conclusions, that's what underpins the findings. And I'm not going to go on and on about all the other benefits to data sharing beyond checking for potential errors or doing meta-analysis. It's already well written about. And I mean, in other disciplines, some groups have looked at this kind of more broadly. And I guess we kind of thought that it was time to kind of see what was going on in psychology specifically, because as people said earlier, things like it feels like it's all quite current, but I mean, open access publications have been around for quite a long time now, and people have been sharing data for quite a while on occasion as well. So we pre-registered a design where we wanted to look not just so much at the prevalence of open data provision within psychology, but more so the completeness of data and the reusability. So the other way of thinking about that question is, is the data that is available, it's fine for it to be there, but how easy or difficult would it be for me to replicate what people have done to actually understand what is there? So we pre-registered our design, and that involved deciding some kind of systematic approach to do this, because obviously we're not going to be able to read every paper that's been published in psychology, in the last 10 years, for example. So we kind of had to think about narrowing it down. We did want to look at how things might have changed over time a bit, but we deliberately looked at 15 journals. And the idea between sort of 2012 and 2017. And the idea was really, the reason we picked these journals was to try and capture both sort of different areas. So you'll see some of these journals might be termed quite general psychology journals. Some are more kind of personality and social. Some are more kind of cognitive science and neuroscience, and some are more applied. So, and they also kind of span sort of, if we want to use the word impact factor, there's a few different impact factors going on there as well. And some of these journals, as you'll see, have changed a bit over time as to what they're doing. So, to be very brief in terms of how we sampled papers, we sort of, as I said, we couldn't look at every single paper, but we did have a systematic approach where we randomly sampled papers from these journals over that 3-year time period. And that involved painstakingly looking at around 2,000 articles. Now, the first kind of headline finding is, after doing all this sampling, only 71 papers had some link to raw data. And just as a kind of side note, it's interesting just to observe that even the papers, when they do have data, there's no real standardized approach as to where that data can be found. So there was definitely at least 1 or 2 papers where the data is in the supplementary materials section, and you're like, oh wow, I thought this would just be supplementary materials, and it turns out that it's all the raw data. And then there's other papers where it looks like it's the raw data, but it's actually just a supplementary table. So there's no, and at the other extreme, there was great papers where there's a link to the OSF framework in the abstract, and it's all there, and it's all fantastic. So that took quite a lot of time. And then in terms of scoring how useful that data was, if it was available, we used a similar scale described by Roche in 2015. They looked at kind of ecology. But basically this looks at both completeness and reusability. So each one of us, so one author did probably more of this than the other 2 authors, but it was a case of going through the data and looking to see how complete it was and how sort of usable it was. Now, I should add that what we also did during this was we took a sample where we double checked it to make sure that there was agreement after this had been done. And generally there was fairly straightforward agreement in what counted as being complete and reusable. So just to kind of give you an example of what we kind of sometimes deal with. So this might be a data set that would appear, on face value, this isn't very complete and it might not be particularly useful because you don't know what any of the values mean. So it would score quite low. But then if there was a data, and also that might be impacted by if it could only be opened in SPSS versus something in like comma separated value that can be opened by anything. And of course it might be improved further if there was a data book or some explanation of why you can see there's a missing value there. So I think as I said, we sort of had checked to see if there was some kind of agreement, and generally we were all agreeing on the same page of what counted as reusable and what we could rerun the analysis. Ultimately the perfect kind of raw data would be one that you could download, see how to redo the analysis and get the same results that were in the paper. But of course, that isn't always what happened. Now, these are kind of just box plots of the completeness scores and the reusability scores for the papers that did have raw data attached to them. And you can see there's a pretty broad scope. There were some excellent examples of papers where not only was the data there, but it was really straightforward and nice to be able to recreate exactly what they did. At the other extreme, there was a lot of papers where there is absolutely no way that you could make head nor tail of the data. So I guess a lot of varied practice, but probably, to me, the most striking thing really, and I think this is where we're sort of at, and this kind of echoes, some of the discussions about, what does it mean for something to be truly open or truly reproducible? The overall results of sort of percentage of articles across different journals does vary quite a lot. In some cases, it's quite promising. In some cases, it's quite disappointing. So there's examples of journals here where during the time periods, they've implemented new policies. And that's meant that pretty much every paper that has data has to have the raw data uploaded in a way that is can be checked. So I think one of the, I can't remember exactly, but I think it's one of the personality journals basically overnight from one year to the next went from, there being very little reusable data attached to papers to a huge jump because everything just had to be done that way. It's interesting that the applied journals we looked at are, probably the worst in terms of just data availability. Which is interesting to try and think about why that is, because on the one hand you think, well, the applied data is actually really important, but then depending on where that data is coming from, that might explain why some of it's not being widely shared. So I think there's, the reality from this project is that, we've kind of found that there's, for all there is some progress, very few papers are directly linking to data in many, though not all, journals. And then even when the data is there, you can't actually use it. Now that's not that different to elsewhere. So in my own experience within sort of medical journals as well, it's often not a lot better. One of the other interesting things about this that is kind of telling, and it kind of echoes to some of the earlier talks about, how does this get better? How do we change it? The lead author, John, wrote a super nice letter to all the editors of the journals that we've looked at. Just when we submitted the paper for publication, just to say, we've gone and done this, we've looked at your journal, this is the kind of results, just as a sort of, I guess, a courtesy thing. And it's really interesting to see editorial responses that are, perfectly positive or sort of like, yeah, that's really interesting, we're working on this and that. And also the editorial responses that were nil, as in, no response whatsoever. And I think one of the things that hasn't been touched on so far today is beyond the kind of the powers with universities, particularly in terms of ref and whatnot, but also the powers that lie with editors and publishers to potentially change these situations. And I spend a disproportionate amount of time being sort of there's so many great editors, but there's also so many editors that I don't know what it is they do. And I think this is an example of where you kind of see that come full circle. There's clearly editors who have made a distinct decision to say, we're going to do this differently, and we're going to make sure that data is identifiable and can be reused, which it should be, to be honest, anyway. I mean, I know it does take extra effort, but it should often be in a good form before it's submitted for publication. And there's other kind of publishers or editors who just, it's not on the radar, put it that way. So within the paper itself, we've kind of tried to come up with some recommendations along these lines to sort of try and suggest how the situation could improve, although I think that last point is poignant in this as well. I should add as well, I'm sure I speak for John and Andrea as well, like there's nothing, we're not writing this or doing this work in the notion that every data set we've ever used or has ever been we've ever worked with is perfectly reusable and perfectly open. You know, that's not the kind of angle that I'm coming at here. There will be cases where sensitive data is difficult to share, and I think there's interesting work going on and obstacles to overcome that. But if nothing else, there has to be a better way in the current system to sort of help identify where open data is available from journals, and help signpost that so that people can actually find it. Because one of the lessons for me in being involved with this is just how difficult that open data is to find, even if it is available. And we had to make some kind of difficult decisions about, well, if we were looking at a paper and the data was available, but only after Googling and finding the author's webpage and then finding something to do with data, does that count as data being available? Or is that not, you know, it's not linked to the paper itself, so someone might not be able to find it. So I think echoing what other people have said about sort of computer code and software code, it's often kind of luck if you can find it, rather than it being signposted clearly within a journal paper. And I think that's where publishers have work to do in that domain, to make it, you know, blatantly obvious where that stuff could be. Because as I kind of said at the start, to me, that stuff's just as important as the actual paper itself, because that's what kind of, you know, gives the whole thing validity in the first place. So I'll stop there.